One of the ways to design this process from a digital standpoint is to put a wireframe over an existing screenshot. So you take a screenshot of, let's say, a GUI that's in a rough form, and then you take that screenshot and you put it into a graphics design program. In this case, I'm going to put it in Inkscape. Inkscape is a nice tool that I've used for several years, and it's the open source version of Adobe Illustrator. There are many such programs, but there's a huge movement of people that work on Inkscape, and so I found it to be a fairly competent tool over the years as it has evolved and got better and stronger. And so I use Inkscape all the time, oftentimes for little things, but sometimes for major things, right? And in this case, I'm going to build a wireframe over this UI. And a wireframe defines a skeletal structure for a user interface. And the great thing about a wireframe is that it allows you to focus on how the layout is supposed to be from a geometrical standpoint before you get into colors and fonts and so on. Because the space is the most important part. That's the most important starting part. And so I did spend a good bit of time at the Art Institutes of Pittsburgh, right? And I learned quite a bit about user interface design, as well as the numerous books that I read on the subject and put it to practice in a lot of my day jobs, right? So when I've built user interfaces, I've used an abundance of design theory in order to lay out screens either up front or in this case in the latter part of the process. I prefer to do it in the latter part of the process because, as I said earlier, I want to make sure that the program and the process is solid, because it's actually a bit more torturous to change a visual design after the fact when a program is going through a little bit of turbulence or a lot of turbulence and you're trying to adjust the design, the visual design at the same time. It's cleaner and more straightforward to do the implementation separate. The behind the scenes implementation and then the front of the scenes. And in all actuality, there are times where I do both, where I'll do a design up front as a guide for the software code behind the scenes, but then I'll go all code for a good while. And then once that code is solid, then move back to the visual design. So here I'm setting up this wireframe, and the wireframe is going to basically incorporate the layout and the different elements, right? And so I basically used the screenshot as a template for how the wireframe can quickly come together. And then once I have the wireframe in place, I can remove the screenshot because it's no longer necessary. I am going to use the eyedropper tool to get started on some of the key colors that I had prototyped in the working user interface. And so this approach is a little bit different than what you may have read in design books in years past, as what I have here is pretty much a consolidated and streamlined version of building a wireframe and a screen mockup all at the same time. So I like this approach because it's quick, it's straightforward, and it's very streamlined. So in this case, I am accounting for each element on the screen. but I may not actually transform those elements in the actual user interface to the exact level that you see here. So this is the finished version of the mockup, right? So I quickly went from wireframe to mockup, and I have a general direction for the visual design of the user interface. So now that I have settled on that, I want to take this opportunity to name each of the visual elements over in the layers part in Inkscape. You can do this in Adobe Illustrator. You can do this in a number of tools that use layers and have objects represented in the layers. So I'm a huge user of layers. They're extremely productive. And by naming these particular items, even though it takes quite a while, and this video is really accelerating through the time frames, but you just have to look at the clock down at the lower right hand corner to see how long it took me to progress through this. But by naming each of those elements, I can export this design, this visual design, to SVG, scalable vector graphics. Say that 3 times fast. Scalable vector graphics, scalable vector graphics. So scalable vector graphics basically is a data format that is supposed to take you right back to a visual design, right? So you can use scalable vector graphics or an SVG data file, and you can read that into a program and produce a visual output, whether it's a report or it's some other kind of graphics that you want to output. So I'm going to get the XML plugin for Notepad++, because what I want to do is, a lot of times when you export XML, it doesn't always come out in a way that is as readable as it could be if it was properly indented. So by using the pretty print function, I'm able to have Notepad++ quickly reformat the XML so that it's easier to read and go through. And so now I'm working with Chat-GPT on converting this SVG to Xaml, Extensible Application Markup Language. It's a data format that Microsoft had defined, in my opinion, based off of an even earlier data format that Adobe had put together for their Firefly initiative, right? So Adobe had this markup language, and I forgot what it's called, but it was an XML-based language, and then about a year later, Microsoft came out with theirs. Anyway, so we now go from this layout that you see here, right, to this. So by applying these tools in the right way, we're not only able to achieve the visual appearance that we want, but we're able to do it in a somewhat streamlined way when we put all the pieces together, right? And so this video does make this process look somewhat streamlined, but once again, I encourage you to look at the timestamp in the lower right-hand corner, because this did take quite some time to work through this, right? Chat-GPT helped in getting things moving more quickly, but of course Chat-GPT, and I say of course Chat-GPT doesn't get it 100% right. So that little 1% or 10% or 20% that Chat-GPT has a gap in, that's going to matter a great deal, right? So the artificial intelligence tools definitely help jog memory and definitely show you like what the solution could kind of look like. But in the present case, in terms of how AI is defined, you still have to reshape it substantially, even if you guide it very carefully. So all of the updates are in GitHub for these visual treatments. And in the next video, I'm going to talk a little bit more about Chat-GPT and visual design. Thank you.